The new iPad Air 4 is out and I've got one in my hands, so it's time to make a video about it. And in this video I want to cover off three separate areas. Firstly, I'll give you my initial thoughts and a mini review. Next we're going to do some benchmarking, and you can see I've got some other devices here that will compare the new iPad Air to. And then I want to answer the question, should you buy this over the iPad Pro? Let's find out. One of the key things that Apple highlighted during the launch for the iPad Air is the variety of colours it's available in. And I saw the sky blue and I thought that looks really nice. So that's the colour that I've gone for here. My initial reaction is, I don't know how well you can see this on camera, but it's not very blue. When you look at Apple's pictures and the promotional video, it comes across as being a very vibrant colour, but in the flesh it's really a very subtle colour. It's more silver. And at the end of the day, I suppose you're going to end up covering it up with a case anyway. So I don't think I would rush out to just buy an iPad Air on the basis of colour. The bezels are really quite small, and in fact it has the same form factor as the 10.9-inch iPad Pro. Hence that question in the intro, would you buy one of these over the iPad Pro? And we'll get to that. There is a slight thickness difference. That's the only change between this and the 10.9-inch iPad Pro. This one is 0.2 of a millimetre thicker. I would imagine that most of the cases that have been made for the iPad Pro would still fit this iPad, but of course it has the fingerprint reader in the power button. So if the case has got one of those sort of silicone bumpers that covers up the buttons, then that's not going to work for this particular iPad. Now, whether you prefer a fingerprint reader or Face ID, that's probably a personal preference thing. I think it's better to have the fingerprint reader at the top rather than have a button on the home screen making the bezels larger. This is a really nice looking device. I actually bought this iPad to replace my wife's old 10.5-inch iPad Pro, and when she was setting it up she struggled a bit with the fingerprint reader. It seemed to take her a long time to get it to identify her fingers. Didn't seem like a great solution, but then I tried adding my fingerprint to it and it was really easy. So it may just be that you've got to get used to that angle of attack with the button. Of course, a big change from the standard iPads is that this has the USB-C connection. I really like having a USB-C connector because I personally use my iPad Pro to plug external devices into. So if I'm out and about and I'm taking photographs, I'll plug in a memory card reader, drop the photos onto my iPad and even do some editing on it. So USB-C certainly opens up more possibilities. That's not to say you can't do it with a Lightning port, but you need to then buy the Lightning to USB adapter and it is much slower. So that's a really nice addition, and something that previously was only available on the iPad Pro. Whilst you're looking at the edge of the device, you'll see that there are essentially two speaker grills on this side and the same again at the top. And this means that you're going to get stereo sound when you're watching movies in landscape mode. With the standard iPad or the iPad mini, you don't get that. Now, whether or not there's actually 4 speakers in here, some people seem to be debating that because all Apple says is that it's stereo. But when you look at the tech spec image on the Apple website, it does seem to indicate that there might be 4 speakers. Obviously, if there is only 2 speakers firing out of the grills on each side, then it'll only be stereo in landscape mode. And Apple doesn't say that on the website, it just says stereo. So I'd expect it to be stereo in portrait mode as well, which means you need 1 in each corner. When it comes to sound, of course, you'll notice there's no headphone jack on this, much like the iPad Pro. So if you want to use headphones, they'll need to be wireless headphones, or you'll need to get a USB-C to 3.5mm jack adapter. Obviously, you get a forward-facing camera, there's a camera on the rear, there's nothing special about these cameras. Obviously, it doesn't support Face ID. I don't expect many people are buying an iPad like this to take photographs, but it's a useful thing to have. You know, if you're sat in a college lecture or a business meeting and you just want to snap what's up on the whiteboard or on the screen and put that into your notes, the camera's a really great way to do that. And scanning documents as well, I use mine for that. Now, of course, this iPad Air supports the Pencil Generation 2 like the iPad Pro, and it magnetically attaches to the side of the iPad and charges wirelessly. The second generation Pencil is certainly a superior experience to the first generation. It's much more convenient having this magnetic attachment, and it feels more comfortable to use. You also get that double tap feature to go into erase mode. When we're talking about the Pencil, we also need to talk about the screen, because this iPad doesn't have the Pro Motion display that's in the Pro iPad, which means it's a 60 Hz display, not a 120 Hz display. Now, for most people, you're never going to really notice the difference in the everyday usage. And particularly if you've never used one of those 120 Hz displays before, you won't notice any different. It's a fantastic display, it's sharp, it's bright, like any iPad display. Where you might notice it is in the response time for the pencil. And again, that's not to say that the pencil lags on a 60 Hz display, but if you're an artist and you're buying the iPad specifically for drawing, then you will appreciate the faster display that's in the iPad Pro. That's probably the main application where you'd notice a difference. I think for most people, it'd be absolutely fine. So that's my quick overview of the iPad Air. It's a nice thing. I haven't had a chance to really put it through its paces yet, and this one is actually my wife's anyway, so I probably won't be doing a lot of messing around with it. It certainly seems very fast, and I think this is a really nice upgrade for her from her 3-year-old 10.5-inch iPad Pro. It's certainly a lot faster, the graphics performance is much better, as we'll come on to in a moment, and that's just a great addition, having the magnetic pencil and USB-C charging. If you've already got a MacBook or a MacBook Pro, then you already have a USB-C charger and you can just use the same one for this. But it does come with a charger in the box, unlike the iPhone 12. So let's move on to benchmarking the performance. Now the iPad Air 4 has the new A14 Bionic chip in it. And I thought it'd be interesting to just compare it against previous generations. So I've got my iPhone 11 here, which has the A13 Bionic, so that's last year's chip in it. And I have my iPad mini, which has the A12 Bionic, so that's 2 years ago. And I've also got my iPad Pro, which is the 12.9-inch version, and this has the A12X chip in it, which is an expanded version of the A12 Bionic. Now, I'm not going to bore you with actually running the benchmarks on all of these things because I've already done that. So let's jump straight to the figures. So I'm using Geekbench 5 for the benchmarks that we're running here. And the first one that I did was for single core performance on the CPU. And the A14 scores 1,582. Now, what does that mean? If you take my iPhone 11 here with the A13 chip, that scored 1,339. And the iPad mini with the A12 in scores 1,117. So you can see that the scores have been steadily increasing over the various generations of these chips. So 1,582 is a very high score, and it's much faster than any iPad that's come before it for single core performance. Just to put that into context, the Intel i9, the 10900K processor that's in the top of the range, 27-inch iMac, scores less than this iPad for single core performance. Now, of course, the iMac would be able to sustain that performance for longer than your iPad will, but isn't it great that you've got such fantastic performance in such a small, convenient device? Let's move on to multi-core. The iPad Air 4 scores 4,040 in multi-core performance. Again, let's compare it to these other devices. The iPhone 11 scored 3,309, and the iPad mini with the A12 chip scored 2,601. Now these three all have 6-core versions of the CPU. For the iPad Pro, they made the A12X with additional cores, and this was then superseded by the A12Z or Z. When it comes to CPU performance, the A12X and the A12Z are pretty much the same as each other, and this scores 4,727 for multi-core. So the iPad Air 4 isn't as fast as the current iPad Pro for multi-core performance, but just think about what's going to be in next year's iPad Pro. If they make an A14X version of this chip, that's going to be one amazing iPad. Where the iPad Air 4 really presses ahead though is on graphics performance, and it has made a stratospheric leap forward from the previous generation. Using Geekbench 5's GPU benchmark, which is focused on the Apple Metal framework, this scores 12,564. And again, to put that into context, the iPhone 11 with the A13 chip, well, that manages 7,502, whereas the iPad mini with the A12 scores 5,377. So you can see that there's been a huge leap forward between the A13 and the A14. Even when you compare it to the A12X here, where Apple put in additional graphics cores to boost the graphics performance in the Pro model, this iPad Pro scores 10,936. The model with the A12Z in it will probably score slightly higher. I think it has one additional GPU core. So the iPad Air 4 outperforms the current iPad Pro for graphics performance. But that's not all. That score of 12,500 is considerable. If you think about the 15-inch MacBook Pro that was being sold last year, the standard model came with the Radeon Pro 555. and that doesn't bench much higher than this iPad Air 4. So we're getting amazing graphics performance in this tiny iPad chassis. When Apple released the iPad Air, of course, they demonstrated some gaming and it looked really impressive. So if gaming is your thing, the iPad Air 4 is going to be a good choice for you. Okay, so what about that question we posed at the outset? If this thing is the same size as the 10.9-inch iPad Pro, it gets the same USB-C connection, it gets the same Apple Pencil Generation 2, and has better single-core performance and better graphics performance, does this make sense to buy instead of the iPad Pro? So the iPad Air 4 starts at £579 in the UK or $599 in the US. And for that you get a 64GB model. The same size iPad Pro starts at £769 in the UK or $799 in the US, but that's for a 128GB version. So what you have to decide is whether or not the extra features in the iPad Pro are worth that additional premium. There are some reasons why you would definitely go for the iPad Pro. For example, if you want the 12.9-inch display, then you've got no choice. You've got to go for the iPad Pro. Again, if you're an artist and you want to spend a lot of time with pencil or you want that ProMotion display, you've got to go with the iPad Pro. If you're desperate to have Face ID on your iPad, you've got to go with the iPad Pro. But if those things aren't as important to you, then the iPad Air 4 makes a lot of sense. Some would say that 64GB of storage isn't enough, but that really depends on how you use your iPad. Many people are saving things in the cloud and are streaming their movies and content from the internet, so they don't actually need loads of storage on their device. iPad Air 4 has a few things going for it. It's got better single-core performance, and that's the thing that's really going to make a difference to your perception of the speed of the device. And it's really not that far behind on multi-core performance either. The faster graphics performance will make a big difference to you if you're doing gaming, or perhaps even doing a bit of light video editing on your iPad. So at £579 or $599, I think this represents excellent value in a tablet. At this price point, there is no faster tablet available, or indeed, there's no faster computer available for that price either. And if you're into the colours, subtle though they are, then the iPad Air 4 has got you covered there too. So I hope you enjoyed this brief review and the benchmarks. In yesterday's podcast, we covered those benchmarks in a little more detail and looked at what it means for the forthcoming Apple Silicon for Macs. So if you're interested in that, check out that episode. And if you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It only costs you one click. Really appreciate the support. And maybe I did enough to earn a thumbs up or a thumbs down if that's your thing. In any case, see you next time for some more geekery.